The weathered planks of the forgotten pirate hideout groaned beneath Malcolm Thorne's boots as decades of salt-worn wood protested his intrusion. Shafts of dusty sunlight pierced through gaps in the ceiling, illuminating the ancient barrels lining the damp walls. Malcolm's calloused hands, marked by 30 years of treasure hunting, trembled slightly as they traced the faded insignia on one particular barrel. Something about this one felt different, a subtle vibration perhaps, or the way the room seemed to darken around it. With a deep breath that tasted of brine and decay, he pried open the lid. A sickly green glow spilled upward, casting ghastly shadows across his weathered face. Malcolm Thorne's weathered hands placed the strange compass on his cluttered desk with uncharacteristic gentleness. The study walls surrounding him displayed the carefully arranged trophies of a lifetime spent chasing legends, maps in protective frames, artifacts in glass cases, and bookshelves overflowing with obscure maritime histories. Another late-night dad. Eliza stood in the doorway, two steaming mugs in hand. At 38, she had her father's analytical mind, but her mother's practical nature. "Just organizing my thoughts," Malcolm replied, discreetly covering the compass with a cloth. "Didn't expect you until tomorrow." Eliza set a mug beside him. "I thought I'd surprise you, though I'm never really surprised to find you working at midnight." The cottage creaked around them, buffeted by coastal winds. Located on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, the modest home had been Malcolm's base of operations since retiring from his university position 15 years earlier. "You found something, didn't you?" Eliza's gaze drifted to the cloth-covered object. Malcolm smiled, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling. "Perhaps the Blackheart expedition. I thought that site was just another dead end." Malcolm reached for his journal, a leather-bound tome filled with decades of notes, sketches, and theories. "That's what everyone thinks. That's what they've always thought." A trace of bitterness crept into his voice. He flipped through pages crowded with his meticulous handwriting until finding his latest entry. William Blackheart Connolly didn't sink with his ship during that storm in 1723. He faked his death. Eliza sighed. "Dad, the historical record is wrong, Liza. My colleagues laughed when I proposed it 30 years ago, but I've found proof." Malcolm had once been a respected history professor specializing in maritime folklore. His promising career derailed when he published a controversial paper suggesting the notorious pirate captain had staged his death to retire with an unprecedented fortune. "That's why they forced me out," he continued. "Thornton and his academic sycophants couldn't handle someone challenging their precious consensus. They didn't force you out. You chose to leave." Eliza reminded him gently. "After they discredited my work and denied my tenure." Malcolm's fingers traced the journal's worn cover. "But none of that matters now. I've found his hideout, exactly where my research suggested." Eliza picked up a faded photograph showing a much younger Malcolm, beaming beside a dark-haired woman holding a baby. "Mom would have wanted you to move on. Caroline understood what drove me." Malcolm's voice softened. "She knew this wasn't just about treasure. Then what is it about? You've spent decades chasing a pirate who died 3 centuries ago." Malcolm stood, moving to the window. Outside, moonlight silvered the churning waves. "It's about truth. History belongs to those who document it. But sometimes those documentarians get it wrong, accidentally or deliberately. And you're the one to correct it," Eliza asked. "Someone has to." Malcolm turned back. "I've spent my life being dismissed as an eccentric with wild theories, but I was right, Liza. The cave system matches the coordinates from the cipher in Blackheart's coded letter. His personal effects were there, including his distinctive ring with the emerald inlay." "That's remarkable," Eliza conceded. "Will you publish your findings?" Malcolm laughed, a rough sound. "So they can claim I fabricated evidence?" "No." He pulled the cloth away, revealing the compass. "But this will change everything." Eliza leaned closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "What is it?" "Not entirely sure," Malcolm admitted, but it bears Blackheart's mark and contains writing in a script I've never encountered before. It looks old, valuable too, beyond valuable. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's the key to understanding Blackheart's final voyage. Malcolm's eyes gleamed with the intensity that had driven him for decades. One last adventure, Liza. One last chance to prove I was right all along. Eliza reached for his hand. You have nothing to prove, not to those academics, not to anyone. I have everything to prove. Malcolm whispered, to myself. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with sudden ferocity as if responding to his words. Neither noticed the compass needle spinning rapidly beneath its glass face, pointing directly at Malcolm's heart. 3 days earlier, Malcolm had stood at the base of the coastal cliff, studying the tattered map in his hands. Decades of salt spray had faded the ink, but the markings remained clear enough to the practiced eye. The parchment trembled slightly in the sea breeze as Malcolm traced the route with his inder. High tide reveals what low tide conceals, he muttered, reciting the cryptic note scrawled in the margin. The rocky shoreline stretched empty in both directions. Malcolm checked his watch, 20 minutes until high tide. Perfect timing. He folded the map carefully, tucking it into an inner pocket of his waterproof jacket. The cave entrance appeared precisely as his research had predicted, a narrow fissure in the cliff face, invisible at low tide, but accessible as the water rose. Malcolm switched on his headlamp and squeezed through the opening. Inside, the passage widened, the ceiling rising high above. The roar of the ocean faded to a distant murmur. His light caught the glint of something embedded in the wall, metal hooks, rusted but still intact, where oil lamps would have hung centuries ago. Blackheart, you clever devil, Malcolm whispered, his voice echoing, a natural harbor hidden from view. He followed the ancient pathway deeper, noting the telltale signs of human modification, smoothed sections where the natural rock had been chiseled away, support beams rotted, but still in place. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, the passage opened into a vast cavern. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. His headlamp couldn't illuminate the entire space, but what it revealed confirmed decades of research. Wooden structures lined the walls, storage shelves, workbenches, what appeared to be sleeping quarters. Time and moisture had taken their toll, but the remoteness of the location and the cave's stable environment had preserved much more than Malcolm had dared hope. My God, he breathed, stepping forward. It's all here. Malcolm moved methodically through the chamber, documenting everything with his camera. The hideout wasn't merely a storage space for treasure, but a fully functioning base of operations. He found tools for ship repair, weapons racks, and areas designated for various crew functions. A raised platform at the far end caught his attention. The remnants of a large table stood there, surrounded by several chairs, one noticeably larger than the others. The captain's place. Malcolm approached reverently, his light playing across the table surface. Maps had been permanently etched into the wood, showing trade routes and patrol patterns of naval vessels, strategic brilliance preserved for centuries. Malcolm ran his fingertips over the carvings, connecting physically with the man whose life had consumed his own. A glint of green caught his eye. Beneath the table, half buried in centuries of silt, something sparkled. Malcolm knelt, brushing away the dirt to reveal a ring with an emerald setting. Blackheart's signet, he whispered, recognizing the distinctive design from historical accounts. The skull with emerald eyes that had sealed the pirates' correspondence and struck fear into merchant captains throughout the Caribbean. Malcolm slipped it into his pocket, heart racing. This single item would vindicate his theories. Proof positive that William Blackheart Conley had not gone down with his ship, but had escaped to this hidden sanctuary. Moving beyond the captain's quarters, Malcolm discovered a storage area lined with barrels. Most had collapsed, their contents long since decayed. But one set apart from the others remained largely intact, bound with metal bands that showed minimal corrosion. The insignia burned into its side didn't match the others. While most bore shipping company marks or simple identifiers, this featured an intricate symbol, a compass rose intertwined with what appeared to be tentacles or waves. Something about it raised the hairs on Malcolm's neck. Unlike the excitement he'd felt upon discovering the ring, this elicited a primitive warning: danger. He circled the barrel cautiously, noting that it had been positioned deliberately away from the others and secured with additional bindings, most now deteriorated. "What were you hiding, Blackheart?" Malcolm murmured. The logical part of his mind, the academic who'd once dismissed seafaring superstitions as the product of isolation and ignorance, suggested the barrel likely contained valuable contraband kept separate for the captain's personal gain. But decades immersed in maritime lore had taught Malcolm that sailors' fears occasionally had foundation. The particular care taken with this barrel suggested something beyond ordinary cargo. Malcolm hesitated, his hand hovering over the lid. 30 years of searching had led to this moment, a vindication of his life's work. Whatever this barrel contained might be the final piece of the puzzle. The decision made itself. With a deep breath, Malcolm pried open the lid. The barrel's lid gave way with a reluctant groan, releasing a gust of stale air that carried the faint scent of brine and something else, metallic and unfamiliar. The sickly green glow illuminated Malcolm's face from below, casting gaunt shadows across his weathered features. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be preserved seaweed, lay an object unlike anything Malcolm had encountered in his decades of research. Roughly the size of his palm, it resembled a compass in basic form, but there all similarity to conventional navigation tools ended. The casing was obsidian, pure black, yet somehow containing depth that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Instead of cardinal directions, symbols Malcolm didn't recognize lined the outer edge, flowing script that reminded him of water in motion. The needle, if it could be called that, wasn't a simple pointer, but an intricate silver trident that currently spun in lazy circles. "Extraordinary," Malcolm whispered, his academic's mind already cataloguing details. The craftsmanship suggested an origin far older than Blackheart's era. The material and design spoke of a culture with techniques unknown to 18th-century European or Caribbean craftsmen. Despite the warning bells ringing in the back of his mind, Malcolm reached into the barrel. His fingers hesitated just above the compass, feeling an unexpected warmth radiating from it. When he finally made contact, a jolt ran up his arm, not painful, but intense, like plunging into cold water. The trident needle stopped spinning instantly, pointing directly at Malcolm. The green glow intensified momentarily, then settled to a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. "Responding to my touch," Malcolm murmured, scientific curiosity momentarily overriding caution. "Or perhaps my bioelectricity." He lifted the compass from its nest. Despite its substantial appearance, it felt oddly light, almost as if it wanted to be carried. The symbols around the edge seemed to shift subtly, rearranging themselves when not directly observed. Something dark and viscous dripped from the compass's edge. Not oil or water, but a substance that evaporated into greenish mist before reaching the ground. Malcolm quickly wrapped the object in his handkerchief and secured it in his satchel. As he did, the temperature in the cavern dropped noticeably. The small waves lapping at the entrance seemed to change rhythm, becoming more deliberate, almost purposeful. A whisper echoed through the chamber, too faint to discern words, but distinctly not the natural sounds of wind or water. Malcolm's rational mind supplied explanations: changing tide patterns, a weather shift outside, his own imagination heightened by the significance of his discovery. Yet 30 years studying maritime legends had taught him to respect sailors' instincts. Something about this place, about this object, felt wrong in a way that transcended scientific explanation. "Time to go," he said aloud, his voice sounding thin in the suddenly oppressive air. Gathering his equipment, Malcolm cast one final glance around the hideout. In his eagerness to explore, he'd lost track of time. The tide would be turning soon, potentially cutting off his exit route. As he moved toward the passage, his headlamp flickered briefly. In that moment of darkness, he could have sworn he saw movement among the rotting barrels, a suggestion of something flowing, like water taking shape. When the light stabilized, nothing was there. The return journey through the narrow passage seemed longer, the walls closer. Twice Malcolm paused, certain he heard footsteps splashing behind him, only to be met with silence when he stopped. The weight of the compass in his satchel grew more noticeable with each step, as if it were becoming denser, more substantial. Reaching the cave entrance, Malcolm found the tide already higher than anticipated. The opening remained accessible, but only just. He squeezed through, the cold Atlantic water soaking him to the waist. As he emerged onto the narrow strip of beach, a wave larger than its predecessors crashed against the cliff face, sealing the entrance completely. Standing on the shore, catching his breath, Malcolm felt a profound sense of having crossed a threshold. The academic in him thrilled at the historical significance of his find, proof positive that Blackheart had survived, evidence of unknown technology that would revolutionize maritime archaeology. But something deeper, more primal, whispered caution. He reached into his satchel, touching the handkerchief-wrapped compass through the fabric. The steady pulse remained, now unquestionably synchronized with his heartbeat. "What exactly did I find?" Malcolm murmured as he began the climb back to the cliff top, unaware of the dark water behind him gathering into a shape that briefly resembled a human form before collapsing back into the waves. Malcolm awoke with a start, his nightshirt damp with sweat, despite the chill in his bedroom. Fragments of his dream clung like seaweed to his consciousness. Endless dark water, something massive moving beneath the surface, watching him with ancient patience. He'd been drowning, yet somehow breathing underwater at the same time. The bedside clock read 3. Outside his window, the ocean churned beneath a clear sky, whitecaps visible in the moonlight. Unusual for this time of year, when the waters were typically calm, sleep eluded him now. Malcolm rose, wrapping his robe around his shoulders. The house felt different somehow, the familiar creaks and settling noises replaced by something that almost resembled breathing. In his study, the compass sat on his desk where he'd left it, the handkerchief now neatly folded beside it, rather than wrapped around it as he distinctly remembered leaving it. The green glow had dimmed to a faint pulse, like a heartbeat in hibernation. "Peculiar," Malcolm murmured, reaching for his magnifying glass. Under closer inspection, the symbols around the edge appeared to be a form of script he'd never encountered, not hieroglyphics, not cuneiform, not any known ancient writing system. He pulled a weathered tome from his bookshelf, Maritime Mythologies of the Colonial Era, and began leafing through the yellowed pages. Something about the compass nagged at his memory, a reference in an obscure account he'd dismissed years ago as superstition. There, a brief mention in a ship's log from Seventine. The vessel had encountered Blackheart's ship, the Tempest, off the coast of Bermuda. The first mate reported that the pirate captain had been possessed of a strange instrument, black as night with markings that moved like water, which he consulted before giving chase, as if it showed him not merely direction, but fortune itself. Malcolm's fingers trembled slightly as he turned to his computer, searching his meticulously organized digital archives. After an hour of cross-referencing, a pattern emerged across scattered accounts, rumors of Blackheart obtaining an artifact from a shipwrecked Portuguese vessel that had been returning from an uncharted island. References to the pirate's uncanny ability to predict naval patrols and merchant shipping routes with supernatural accuracy. Whispers among his crew of a devil's compass that drove men to madness if they gazed upon it too long. Most telling was the record of Blackheart's final voyage. The Tempest had been caught in an unnatural storm, one that affected only the pirate vessel, while nearby ships reported clear weather. Witnesses described the sea itself rising up, as if with purpose, to pull the ship down. All hands were presumed lost. But Malcolm had proved otherwise. Blackheart had survived, retreating to his hidden sanctuary with the compass. The question was, why hide it? If the compass truly gave him an advantage, why seal it away? A sharp crack of thunder broke his concentration. Malcolm looked up, startled. The weather report had predicted clear skies, yet outside his window storm clouds now gathered with unnatural speed directly over the ocean. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the turbulent waters. As if responding to the storm, the compass's glow intensified. The trident needle spun rapidly before stopping, pointing not north but directly toward the brewing tempest. A movement at the edge of his vision made Malcolm turn sharply. For an instant he thought he saw a figure standing in the corner of his study, a silhouette composed of shadow and water, observing him with eyeless regard. When he blinked, nothing was there but the play of lightning shadows through the window. His phone rang, startling him. Eliza's name flashed on the screen. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice sounded tight with worry. "I'm fine. Why?" "I just had the strangest dream about you. You were underwater, and something was—" She paused. "It sounds ridiculous now." Malcolm glanced at the compass, its glow pulsing in time with the distant lightning. "What kind of something?" "I don't know. Something old. Watching you." She sighed. "I woke up feeling like I needed to check on you." Outside, the unnatural storm intensified, rain now lashing against the windows in patterns that almost resembled symbols matching those on the compass. "Actually," Malcolm said slowly, "perhaps you should come by tomorrow. I found something interesting in my research." After ending the call, Malcolm returned to the historical record that had caught his attention, the account of a sailor who had served briefly aboard the Tempest. The man had deserted after witnessing Blackheart consulting the compass, claiming afterward that when the captain gazed into it, something else had looked back through his eyes. The old leather-bound book slipped from Malcolm's lap, landing open on the floor. As he bent to retrieve it, he froze. In the reflection of his window darkened by the storm outside, it wasn't his face looking back at him, but something else. Something with eyes like the depths of the ocean, and a patient, ancient hunger. The knock at Malcolm's door came precisely at noon, though the day remained strangely dark. The storm had lingered through the morning, defying meteorological predictions and concerning local fishermen, who remained in port despite favorable tide conditions. "Helena," Malcolm said, surprised to find not his daughter, but his former colleague on his doorstep. Dr. Helena Walsh stood wrapped in a raincoat, her silver-streaked hair plastered to her head. "I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't expecting to come," she replied, her Irish accent thickened by evident agitation. "May I enter?" Malcolm stepped aside. Helena had been one of the few academics who hadn't openly ridiculed his theories, though she had maintained a professional skepticism. As the foremost expert on Caribbean maritime history, her cautious defense had preserved what little academic reputation he had left. She removed her coat, revealing the practical attire she'd always favored, khaki trousers and a sensible blouse. Her eyes, normally warm with scholarly enthusiasm, now held unmistakable worry. "What brings you out in such weather?" Malcolm asked, leading her to the study. "A colleague at the British Museum forwarded me your email inquiry about symbolic languages associated with pre-colonial Caribbean artifacts." She stopped abruptly in the doorway, her gaze fixed on the compass still sitting on Malcolm's desk. "Oh, Malcolm, tell me you didn't." "Didn't what?" he asked, though her reaction confirmed his growing suspicions about the artifact's significance. Helena approached the desk cautiously, as one might a venomous snake. "You found it, Blackheart's compass." "The Maria Negra, the black tide," Malcolm translated. "So you know of it." "Legends, whispers in the academic periphery." She wouldn't take her eyes from the object, too consistent across too many isolated sources to dismiss entirely, though most consider it maritime folklore. "But not you." Helena finally looked at him. "My grandmother was from a small fishing village in Galicia. They had stories of a black compass that could control the sea but demanded a terrible price. I researched similar legends throughout my career, carefully, Quietly, from her bag she withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. This was recovered from a Portuguese archive during renovation work in 2015. It was hidden in a wall, sealed with wax, and surrounded by religious symbols. The museum curator is a friend who knows my interest in maritime artifacts. He sent me a copy before submitting it for official cataloguing. Malcolm opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a letter written in faded ink, the handwriting cramped and urgent. It's from Antonio Caldera, first mate aboard the São Cristóvão, Helena explained. The Portuguese galleon Blackheart captured before his disappearance. Malcolm scanned the text. His Portuguese was rudimentary, but he understood enough. The writer described how their ship had discovered an island not on any charts after being blown off course. There they found ruins of an unknown civilization and artifacts, including a black compass with moving symbols. Their captain became obsessed with it, claiming it whispered secrets of controlling the very sea itself. The captain began performing rituals Malcolm read aloud, offering blood to the compass. The sea grew calm when he commanded. Storms formed at his word, but each time the price grew steeper. The whispers grew louder. Men began disappearing at night. Helena nodded grimly. The São Cristóvão was later attacked by the tempest. Blackheart killed the captain and took the compass for himself, and fell under the same influence, Malcolm concluded, looking at the artifact with new weariness. According to my research, Blackheart was initially elated with his prize. The tempest became untouchable, able to appear from calm seas and disappear into storms of its own making. But over time, the crew reported changes in their captain. Erratic behavior, speaking in tongues, standing at the bow conversing with the empty air. What is it, Helena? Really? She hesitated. The legends vary, but consistent elements emerge. An ancient sea deity called Nyx Maria by some cultures, worshipped by a pre-colonial civilization that disappeared suddenly. The compass was created to contain a fragment of its essence, but the boundary is permeable. It influences its possessor, promising power over the seas while gradually allowing the entity to establish a foothold in our world. Malcolm thought of the strange reflections, the whispering voices, the unnatural storm. And you believe this? I believe that Blackheart eventually did, Helena replied. My theory is that he realized the danger too late. His final voyage wasn't ended by a storm. He deliberately sailed to his hidden sanctuary to contain the compass where it couldn't be found. She fixed Malcolm with an intense stare. You need to return it, Malcolm. Seal it away exactly as you found it. I can't, Malcolm said. This is the validation of my life's work. Proof that Blackheart survived. Your work has already been validated by finding the hideout, Helena countered. The compass is something else entirely, something dangerous. She glanced toward the window where the unnatural storm continued to rage. I fear it's already too late. The persistent drip from Malcolm's bathroom faucet had developed a rhythm unlike any plumbing malfunction he'd encountered before. 3 quick drops, pause, 2 slow drops, pause, repeat. He'd tightened the valve twice, yet the pattern continued unabated. Most disturbing was how the water pooled in the sink basin, refusing to drain despite the open plug. Dad, are you listening to me? Eliza's voice pulled him back to the kitchen, where they sat across from each other, steam rising from untouched tea. Sorry, Malcolm rubbed his bloodshot eyes. I didn't sleep well. That's obvious. Eliza studied him with growing concern. You look terrible. Have you eaten today? Malcolm couldn't remember. The past 36 hours had blurred together. Research interspersed with strange occurrences that defied rational explanation. The unnatural storm had finally abated that morning, leaving behind peculiar patterns of seaweed on the beach below his cottage, arranged in shapes reminiscent of the symbols on the compass. I've been preoccupied, he said. Helena's visit yesterday was quite illuminating. Dr. Walsh came here. What did she want? Malcolm hesitated. Eliza, had always been pragmatic, skeptical of the more fantastical elements of maritime lore that occasionally intersected with his research. How would she wait to talk of ancient sea deities and possessed pirate captains? She had information about an artifact I found at the hideout, he said carefully. A sharp crack from his study interrupted them, something falling. Malcolm rose too quickly, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over him. "Dad," Eliza steadied him with a concerned hand. "I'm fine," he insisted, though the persistent headache that had started after handling the compass pulsed behind his eyes. "Let me check what fell." In the study, they found his voice recorder on the floor, its plastic casing cracked. Malcolm had left it on his desk the previous evening, recording ambient sounds after hearing strange whispers when reviewing his notes. "How did this get on the floor?" Eliza asked, picking it up. "I don't know." Malcolm took the device, rewinding to the last recording. Static filled the room, interrupted by the creaking sounds of the old cottage. Then, beneath the background noise, unmistakable whispering, not in English, not in any language Malcolm recognized, yet somehow he understood fragments: freedom, power, alliance. Most disturbing was the final segment, Malcolm's own voice responding in the same unknown tongue. "What was that?" Eliza asked, her face pale. "Is this some kind of joke? I was asleep when this was recorded." Malcolm said quietly. "Then who?" Eliza's gaze drifted to the desk, where the compass sat. The pulsing green light had intensified, the trident needle spinning slowly but deliberately. "What is that thing?" Before Malcolm could answer, the compass needle stopped abruptly, pointing directly at him. A sharp pain lanced through his temple, bringing him to his knees. "Dad!" Eliza crouched beside him, but Malcolm barely heard her through the roaring in his ears, the sound of deep ocean currents, of ancient tides. A voice that was not a voice spoke directly into his mind. "We have waited centuries for one who understands the depths, as you do. Malcolm Thorne." "Who are you?" Malcolm whispered, unaware he'd spoken aloud until he saw Eliza's frightened expression. "You know," the voice replied. "You have always known. Since childhood, when you first dreamed of breathing underwater. We called to you then." Memories surfaced, recurring dreams throughout his life of exploring endless underwater realms, of ancient cities beneath the waves. Dreams he'd attributed to an overactive imagination and his lifelong fascination with the sea. "Dad, who are you talking to?" Eliza's voice seemed to come from far away. The compass glowed brighter, casting sickly green shadows across the study. The trident needle began to spin again, faster now, generating a low humming sound that made the glass cases of artifacts vibrate in sympathy. "The compass doesn't predict fortunes," Malcolm murmured, pieces falling into place. "It contains something alive." As if in Ms. The water in the glass on his desk began to rise, defying gravity. It formed a perfect sphere, floating in mid-air before reshaping itself into a miniature humanoid figure that regarded them with eyeless attention. Eliza scrambled backward. "What's happening?" "A manifestation," Malcolm said, academic interest momentarily overriding fear. "It's using water as a physical medium." The watery figure pointed at the compass, then at Malcolm. The voice returned to his mind. "Release us fully and knowledge beyond mortal understanding will be yours. Every mystery of the deep, every secret black heart sought to hide. Your name will eclipse his in history." The figure collapsed suddenly as Eliza knocked the glass over with a shaking hand. Water splashed across the desk, soaking papers, but carefully flowing around the compass itself. "We need to get rid of that thing," she said, eyes wide. "Right now." Malcolm nodded slowly, the pain in his head subsiding. Helena was right. It's dangerous. Yet even as he agreed, part of him recoiled at the thought of parting with the artifact. The validation of his theories, the key to knowledge no other historian possessed. He reached for the compass, intending to re-wrap it in the protective cloth. As his fingers touched the obsidian surface, the trident needle spun violently before stopping, pointing at Eliza. Malcolm felt a surge of possessive anger that wasn't entirely his own. "Don't touch it," he heard himself say, the words emerging harsher than intended. "Nix Maria," Helena read aloud, her finger tracing the faded text in the ancient tome spread across Malcolm's dining table. "The tide that hungers, the depth that watches." 3 days had passed since the water manifestation. Eliza had refused to leave, setting up in the guest room despite Malcolm's insistence that he could handle the situation. The compass now sat inside a locked steel box lined with symbols Helena had provided, temporary containment that muffled but didn't eliminate its influence. "This text is from 1619, Helena continued, written by a Spanish monk who interviewed survivors from early colonial expeditions. Multiple indigenous cultures across the Caribbean and coastal South America shared legends of an entity that dwelled in the deep waters, capable of controlling tides and storms." Malcolm leaned closer, his academic focus sharpened despite the persistent whispers at the edge of his consciousness. "Different names, but consistent attributes." "Exactly. The Taino called it Yokahu, the Caribs named it Barana, but the descriptions align, an ancient power that could grant control over the sea in exchange for offerings." Helena turned the brittle page carefully. "What's fascinating is the connection to a pre-colonial civilization that supposedly created artifacts to communicate with and potentially contain aspects of this entity." Eliza, who had been skeptically observing from the doorway, finally joined them at the table. "You're both talking about this like it's real. After what you witnessed," Malcolm began. "I witnessed something," Eliza conceded. "But ancient sea gods? This sounds like the plot of a horror movie. The distinction between deity and entity is important," Helena said without looking up. "Indigenous accounts don't portray Nix Maria as a god in the traditional sense, but as a force of nature that attained consciousness, ancient beyond human comprehension, but not supernatural in origin. Like a very old, very powerful alien," Malcolm suggested. "That doesn't make me feel better," Eliza muttered. Helena opened another book, this one bound in weathered leather with copper clasps. "This is from my personal collection, extremely rare, only 3 copies survived the Inquisition's purges. It details the civilization that created the compass." The pages revealed intricate illustrations of an island city with architecture unlike any known pre-colonial style, buildings that appeared to flow like water frozen in time, structures that merged seamlessly with the natural coastline. They called themselves the Mariethol, roughly translated as "those who speak with the tide." Helena explained. Advanced astronomers, mathematicians, and seafarers who mapped ocean currents with unprecedented accuracy. They believed Nix Maria granted them knowledge in exchange for their devotion. "What happened to them?" Eliza asked, reluctantly drawn into the narrative. Helena's expression darkened. "According to fragmentary accounts, they created artifacts, like the compass, to contain portions of Nix Maria's essence, allowing them to harness its power more directly. But something went catastrophically wrong." She turned to a page showing the island half submerged, buildings crumbling as massive waves crashed over them. Their entire civilization disappeared in a single night. Survivors, who had been at sea during the cataclysm, reported that the water itself rose up and consumed the island. Nix Maria turned against them. Malcolm surmised, or they lost control of what they'd contained. Helena countered. The compass wasn't designed merely to navigate, it was created to imprison a fragment of Nix Maria while allowing controlled access to its power. "A containment vessel," Malcolm murmured, thinking of the barrel carefully set apart from the others in Blackheart's hideout. "Precisely. The Portuguese sailors who found it didn't understand what they'd discovered. Neither did Blackheart, initially." Helena closed the book gently. "But I believe he eventually realized the danger. The historical record shows the Tempest became increasingly erratic in its final year. appearing in impossible locations, surviving storms that sank other vessels, attacking ships with unprecedented savagery. And then Blackheart vanished, Malcolm said, taking the compass to his secret hideout and sealing it away. Not just sealing it, Helena emphasized. The barrel you described, with its special markings and isolation from the other supplies, that suggests Blackheart understood at least partially what he was dealing with. He created a primitive but effective secondary containment system, which I broke, Malcolm acknowledged grimly. We all make mistakes in pursuit of knowledge, Helena said kindly. What matters is how we address them. So what exactly does this thing want? Eliza asked. Practical as always. Helena's expression grew grave. Freedom. The compass contains only a fragment of Nyxmeria's essence. With enough influence over a human host, it could potentially manifest fully in our world. Using water as its physical medium, Malcolm added, recalling the floating figure in his study. Yes, water is its domain, its body in a sense. Helena glanced toward the windows, where rain had begun falling again despite clear skies in the forecast. Have you noticed an increase in precipitation since you found the compass? Malcolm nodded slowly. The weather patterns have been unusual. It's gathering strength, Helena said quietly, building a reservoir of its element around us. For what purpose? Eliza asked. Before Helena could answer, a sound like rushing waves filled the room. The locked box containing the compass began to vibrate, skittering across the sideboard where Malcolm had placed it. It knows we're talking about it, Malcolm whispered, a chill running down his spine. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, stars glittered in the clear night sky. The next, clouds boiled overhead like a time-lapse of destruction, greenish lightning branching through their churning depths. The sea below Malcolm's cottage heaved and writhed, waves crashing against the cliff with unnatural precision, as if testing for weaknesses. This isn't a normal weather pattern, Helena said, securing the shutters as wind howled through every crack in the old building. It's focused directly over us. Malcolm stood transfixed at the window, watching water surge up the cliff face higher than any natural tide could reach. The locked box containing the compass vibrated violently on the sideboard, emitting a high-pitched keening that set their teeth on edge. We need to leave, Eliza insisted, practical even in crisis. Pack what's essential and get to higher ground. The compass can't be moved carelessly, Helena cautioned. In this agitated state, transportation could weaken the containment further. A sound like breaking glass came from upstairs, followed by a steady rush of water. Malcolm ran to the staircase, finding a stream cascading down the steps. The bathroom pipes have burst, he called. That's not possible, Eliza said, joining him. I shut off the main water valve an hour ago. The realization hit them simultaneously. The water wasn't coming from the pipes. Every drain in the house had reversed flow, disgorging water that moved with deliberate purpose rather than following the laws of gravity. The compass's keening reached a fever pitch. Inside the sealed box, the lock mechanism shattered with a sharp crack. The lid flew open, revealing the obsidian artifact glowing like toxic fire, its trident needle spinning so rapidly it appeared as a solid disk. Water from the stairs and faucets converged in the center of the living room, rising into a column that gradually assumed humanoid form, taller than a man, with suggestions of robes flowing around a body that remained translucent and fluid. Where a face should be, only deeper currents swirled, yet the impression of ancient, patient malevolence radiated from it like cold. Nyxmeria, Helena whispered, instinctively stepping back. The water form turned toward her, acknowledging the name with a slight bow that sent droplets spattering across the floorboards. When it spoke, the voice emerged not from the figure but from all the water in the room simultaneously, creating an effect of disorienting surround sound. The scholar knows us, it said, the English words precisely formed yet carrying undertones of crashing waves and deep ocean pressure. But incompletely. Malcolm stepped forward despite Eliza's restraining hand. Academic curiosity temporarily overrode his fear. What are you? The water form rippled with what might have been amusement. We are the deep that was before your kind crawled from the tide pools. We are the pressure that shapes continents. We are the memory of the world ocean that covered all. Why have you been trapped in the compass? Malcolm asked. Not trapped. Fragmented. The figure flowed closer to Malcolm. A portion of our essence, separated and contained by those who sought our power without understanding our nature. The Mariathal, Helena said. Their name for themselves, yes. They promised worship but attempted bondage instead. The water form's outline sharpened momentarily with what seemed like anger. They paid the price of their betrayal. You destroyed them, Eliza said, her voice steady despite her evident fear. We reclaimed what was ours. The entity turned to her. As we shall again. Malcolm moved protectively toward his daughter, but found himself unable to approach her. An invisible barrier of pressure held him in place. What do you want from us? From them. Nothing, the entity replied, gesturing toward Helena and Eliza. From you, Malcolm Thorne. We require completion. Completion, Malcolm echoed. The compass contains us, but incompletely. The binding weakens after centuries, but requires assistance to fully break. The water form extended what might have been a hand toward Malcolm. You are uniquely suited to this task. Your mind has touched ours since childhood. Your dreams have swum our depth. Memories flooded Malcolm's consciousness, recurring dreams throughout his life, of underwater realms, of breathing beneath the waves, of ancient cities where water and stone merged seamlessly. Dreams that had inspired his fascination with maritime history. You've been influencing me my entire life, he realized with dawning horror. Guiding me toward the compass, preparing you, the entity corrected. Blackheart resisted us too long, his mind too rigid with superstition. You understand the fluidity of history, the malleability of truth. You are compatible. Don't listen, Dad, Eliza urged. It's manipulating you. The water form surged suddenly, flowing around Malcolm in a rapid spiral that cut him off from the others. Within the watery barrier, the entity's voice became intimate, seductive. We offer knowledge no human has possessed, the true history of your world, the secrets of civilizations lost beneath the waves, your life's work vindicated beyond imagination. At what cost? Malcolm managed to ask, feeling pressure building in his skull. Merely your consent, the entity whispered, its watery essence now touching Malcolm's skin, cold, yet somehow inviting. Accept our fragment into yourself, become our vessel, and together we shall release our full being from the deep prison where the Mariathal bound it. Through the translucent barrier, Malcolm saw Helena frantically paging through her books, while Eliza attempted to reach him. Their voices came muffled, as if he were already underwater. Choose, Nex Moria commanded, the compass rising from its box to hover before Malcolm, its trident needle pointing directly at his heart. The watery barrier surrounding Malcolm rippled with disturbed currents as Eliza smashed a chair against it. The wood splintered upon impact but left the fluid wall intact. Through the distortion, Malcolm saw his daughter's sarsus expression as she searched for something else to use. Physical force is meaningless against our essence. Nyx Meria's voice reverberated around him. She cannot reach you. A new voice cut through the cottage, aged but commanding, speaking words in a language Malcolm didn't recognize. The entity's form shuddered, water droplets splattering across the floor as its cohesion momentarily faltered. Father Thomas stood in the doorway, a weathered man in his 70s wearing a fisherman's rain slicker rather than clerical attire. His gnarled hands clutched a small book, bound in faded blue leather, from which he continued to read in the unknown language. Interference, Nyx Meria hissed, its watery form contracting defensively. The old faith persists. With each phrase Father Thomas uttered, the water barrier of Malcolm thinned. Helena moved quickly, unrolling a cloth covered with symbols similar to those on the compass, but arranged in patterns of opposition and containment. Malcolm, she called, you must reject it willingly. Its fragment can only bond with your consciousness through consent. The entity surged toward Father Thomas, but the old priest held up a pendant, a simple stone disc etched with concentric circles and wave patterns. Nix Maria recoiled as if burned. "The sign of the Watchers," it seethed. "You are one of them." "The last in my family line," Father Thomas acknowledged, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of the local coastal community. "We have waited centuries, knowing this day would come." Malcolm felt the pressure in his mind easing as the entity's attention divided. The compass still hovered before him, its glow pulsing erratically. "What's happening?" he managed to ask. "The fishing communities along this coast," Helena explained quickly. "Some are descendants of those who survived the destruction of the Mara Ethel civilization. They've preserved knowledge, passed down through generations, superstition and fragments." Nix Maria interrupted. "They know nothing of our true nature." "We know enough," Father Thomas countered, advancing steadily. "We know you cannot take physical form without a willing vessel. We know the symbols that can contain you." The entity's watery form rippled with what might have been laughter. "For how long, Watcher? Your numbers dwindle. Your knowledge fades with each generation. There are so few who remember the old ways now." Father Thomas didn't deny this. "But we endure as we have since our ancestors witnessed your wrath." The compass's needle spun frantically as the entity's focus returned to Malcolm. "They offer you nothing but restrictions and fear. We offer understanding beyond human comprehension, the true history of your words. Isn't that what you've sought your entire life?" Malcolm felt the temptation like a physical pull, to know with certainty the maritime mysteries he'd spent decades pursuing, the lost civilizations, the forgotten voyages, the truth behind legends. "Dad," Eliza's voice penetrated his thoughts. "Remember why you became a historian in the first place? Not for certainty, but for the search itself." The realization struck Malcolm with unexpected clarity. His academic passion had never been about possessing absolute knowledge, but about the methodical pursuit of understanding, the careful piecing together of fragments, the thrill of discovery, the constant questioning and refinement of theories. "You're right," he said, not to the entity, but to his daughter. With deliberate effort, Malcolm stepped back from the compass. "I reject your offer." The water surrounding him churned violently. "You cannot refuse us. You opened the way." "And I can close it," Malcolm replied, finding strength in his decision. Father Thomas pressed forward, still reciting from his book. He removed the pendant from around his neck and held it out to Malcolm. "Take that. It has been passed down through my family for generations, waiting for this moment." Malcolm reached through the thinning water barrier and grasped the stone disc. It felt warm to the touch, vibrating slightly with an energy that countered the compass's pull. "The amulet contains protective symbols," Helena explained. "It disrupts the entity's influence." The watery form of Nix Maria contracted further, drawing back toward the compass. "This delays nothing," it warned. "The binding weakens with each passing hour. We have waited centuries. We can wait longer. What do we do now?" Eliza asked, helping Malcolm to a chair as his legs suddenly weakened. Father Thomas closed his book. "We prepare. The amulet and the words of binding are temporary measures at best." "There must be a more permanent solution," Malcolm insisted. "There is," Father Thomas said gravely. "According to our traditions, the entity can be returned to its prison within the compass through a ritual performed at the site of its original binding." "The pirate hideout," Malcolm realized. Helena nodded. "The barrel you found wasn't just storage, it was part of a containment system Blackheart created, likely guided by knowledge similar to what Father Thomas's ancestors preserved." "But we'll need help," Father Thomas added. "I know the ritual words, but not all the components required. There are symbols and procedures beyond what my family maintained." "I might know someone," Helena said. "A colleague in maritime archaeology who specializes in pre-colonial Caribbean civilizations, Professor Nakamura from Kyoto University." His focus has been the symbolic languages of lost coastal cultures. Can he be trusted with this? Malcolm asked, watching the compass as it settled back into its box, the entity's manifestation now reduced to a thin film of water surrounding the artifact. "We have little choice," Father Thomas said. "The storm is momentarily abated, but it will return stronger." The entity gathers power with each manifestation. As if confirming his words, the compass pulsed once, and all the water in the room, including every drop of the entity's diminished form, suddenly evaporated, transforming into a mist that seeped through the cottage walls and dissipated into the night air. It's retreated to gather strength, Father Thomas explained. "We have a brief respite, nothing more." "Then we'd better use it," Malcolm said, clutching the protective amulet tightly. Professor Kaito Nakamura arrived shortly before dawn, having driven through the night from London, where he'd been guest lecturing at the British Museum. Despite the early hour and hasty journey, he appeared impeccably composed, a slight man in his 60s, with silver-streaked black hair and alert eyes that missed nothing. "Dr. Walsh," he greeted Helena with a formal bow before turning to Malcolm. "Dr. Thorne, your work on Caribbean maritime folklore has been unjustly overlooked by mainstream academia. Under different circumstances, the validation from such a respected scholar would have gratified Malcolm. Now, with the compass secured in a reinforced container inscribed with protective symbols Father Thomas had provided, scholarly surgeonance seemed trivial. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Malcolm said, leading the professor into the cottage. Helena's message suggested an unprecedented discovery with some urgency attached. Professor Nakamura's gaze swept the room, noting the water damage, the protective symbols Helena had placed in doorways and windows, and the haggard appearance of everyone present. "I see the situation is even more serious than implied." Father Thomas stepped forward, introducing himself simply as a local fisherman with knowledge of regional traditions. If Professor Nakamura found this unusual, he showed no sign of it. "What can you tell us about this?" Helena asked, carefully opening the reinforced container. The compass lay dormant within, its green glow subdued to a faint pulse. Professor Nakamura drew in a sharp breath, instinctively reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small leather case. From it, he produced a ceremonial dagger with a blade of polished obsidian and a handle wrapped in weathered cord. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the compass without touching it. At Malcolm's nod, the professor used the tip of the dagger to gently rotate the compass, studying the symbols around its edge. His expression shifted from academic interest to deep concern. "This is not merely a historical artifact," he said finally. "This is a kenpuak, what my research identifies as a binding vessel. You recognize it?" Helena asked. "Not this specific object, but its type." Professor Nakamura carefully returned the dagger to its case. "My research focuses on a pre-colonial civilization that mysteriously vanished approximately 3,000 years ago. They left behind sophisticated artifacts with a distinctive symbolic language related to oceanic forces. The Malevolent, Malcolm provided. Professor Nakamura looked up sharply. "You know of them. Most of my colleagues consider my work on their existence speculative at best." "We've been compiling information," Helena explained, gesturing to her books, spread across the dining table. "Though our knowledge is fragmentary, as is mine despite decades of study." Professor Nakamura accepted the cup of tea Eliza offered with a gracious nod. The Malevolent achieved a level of understanding regarding tidal forces and ocean currents that wasn't matched until the modern era. Their architectural and mathematical achievements suggest knowledge that should have been impossible given the available technology of their time. "Because they had help," Father Thomas said quietly. Professor Nakamura studied the old priest with new interest. "Your coastal traditions preserve this history." "Pieces of it," Father Thomas acknowledged. "Warnings, mainly, about the entity they contacted from the deep." Professor Nakamura's composed expression faltered momentarily. "You speak of Nix Maria. It wasn't a question." "You know the name," Malcolm observed. I have encountered references in multiple isolated cultures across the Pacific and Atlantic regions, different names, but describing the same concept, an ancient consciousness residing in the deep ocean, predating humanity, with dominion over water in all its forms. The professor sipped his tea thoughtfully. I assumed these were allegorical representations of natural forces, not literal descriptions. Until now, Helena said. Indeed. Professor Nakamura set down his cup carefully. What have you witnessed? They took turns describing the events since Malcolm discovered the compass, the manifestations, the communications, the entity's clear agenda. Professor Nakamura listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. The Kenpuak. This compass was not created to navigate in the conventional sense, he explained when they finished. It was designed as a prison for a fragment of Nixmaria's consciousness. The physical object anchors the entity's essence in our dimension, while simultaneously containing it. But it's deteriorating, Malcolm noted. All bindings weaken over time, Professor Nakamura confirmed, especially when removed from their supporting containment systems. The barrel in the hideout, Malcolm realized. Precisely. From your description, the pirate captain understood enough about the artifact's nature to maintain its secondary containment. When you removed it from that environment, you accelerated the binding's decay. Can it be repaired? Eliza, Professor Nakamura withdrew an aged journal bound in faded red leather from his briefcase. Potentially. My research has identified references to a ritual of binding performed by the Mariathal priests. It required specific components and had to be conducted at a place where the boundary between our world and the deep realm is naturally thin. Like the pirate hideout, Helena suggested. A sea cave with unusual properties. That would be suitable, Professor Nakamura agreed. But the ritual requires a specific tool. He held up the obsidian dagger. This is a ceremonial blade recovered from a submerged Mariathal temple off the coast of Venezuela. According to my translation of the inscriptions on its hilt, it was used to separate the waters. A poetic description, but possibly referring to dividing Nixmaria's essence. You brought exactly what we need, Malcolm asked skeptically. Professor Nakamura smiled slightly. Not coincidence, Dr. Thorne. When I received Helena's message, describing the compass and the symbols, I recognized their significance immediately. I've spent my life searching for concrete evidence of the Mariathal civilization and their connection to what I believed was a mythological entity. His expression became solemn. I never anticipated finding both simultaneously, or that the legends might be so literally true. The journey back to the pirate hideout proved treacherous beyond natural explanation. Though meteorological reports showed clear weather throughout the region, their small party battled conditions that seemed targeted specifically at them. Sudden squalls appearing from nowhere, fog banks materializing and dissipating with uncanny precision, waves that struck only their section of coastline. It knows our intentions, Father Thomas said grimly as they navigated the narrow path down the cliff face. The tide had cooperated at least, revealing the cave entrance just as Malcolm had first found it. Malcolm led the way, the protective amulet hanging heavy around his neck. Behind him came Professor Nakamura carrying his precious dagger, then Helena with her books of reference, and finally Eliza and Father Thomas flanking the reinforced container that held the compass. The entity is most vulnerable at the site of its previous containment, Professor Nakamura had explained during their preparations. The lingering energy of the original binding creates a resonance that weakens its resistance. Now, as they entered the dark passage, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom, Malcolm felt an oppressive weight settling over them, not physical pressure, but a palpable sense of ancient malevolence, aware of their presence. Something's different, he warned, noticing subtle changes in the tunnel. The walls glistened with excessive moisture, and several times their lights caught what appeared to be handprints formed in the condensation, disappearing when directly illuminated. The main chamber of the hideout had transformed in Malcolm's absence. Water seeped from the ceiling in dozens of small streams that defied gravity, flowing horizontally and even upward in places to create intricate patterns across the walls. patterns that resembled the symbols on the compass. "It's been preparing," Professor Nakamura observed, examining the unnatural water flows, saturating its territory. "Look there." Helena pointed toward what had been Blackheart's private quarters. "That doorway wasn't open before." She was right. During his initial exploration, Malcolm had noted the captain's table and personal effects, but hadn't seen any additional chambers. Now a narrow opening revealed itself in the rock wall behind the captain's chair. The water pressure must have shifted the stone, Malcolm theorized, though he suspected a more deliberate cause. "We should investigate," Professor Nakamura suggested. "The ritual will be most effective if performed at the precise location of the original binding." Malcolm led the way through the narrow opening, finding himself in a smaller chamber that clearly served as Blackheart's private sanctuary. A simple cot stood against one wall, alongside a writing desk bolted to the floor. Most striking was the set of shelves carved directly into the rock, containing a collection of books protected from the damp by oilcloth coverings. "A pirate's library," Helena marveled, carefully examining the volumes without touching them. Navigation journals, astronomical texts, and she paused at a large book bound in faded blue leather. "This appears to be Blackheart's personal log." "We don't have time for academic exploration," Father Thomas reminded them, his weathered hands clutching his book of rituals more tightly as water droplets began forming into intricate patterns on the ceiling above them. "Wait," Malcolm said, something catching his eye. He carefully lifted the logbook, its leather cover stiff with age and salt. The pages within were filled with a bold, educated hand. Surprising for a man history had portrayed as a brutal, illiterate pirate. The early entries confirmed many of Malcolm's theories. William Blackheart, Connolly, had indeed been a naval officer before turning to piracy. Educated at Oxford and possessed of considerable knowledge in mathematics and astronomy, his calculated decision to fake his death and establish the hidden base had been motivated not by fear of capture, but by a discovery that changed his understanding of the world. Malcolm turned to the final entries dated after Blackheart's supposed death at sea. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the content disturbing. "The compass speaks to me now without ceasing. It promises dominion over the seas themselves if I but surrender my will to it. The crew grows fearful of my behavior, not understanding the power within my grasp. I have begun to see the truth. This is no mere tool but a prison for something ancient, something that hungers for freedom." The next entry, dated 3 weeks later: "I have sent the remaining loyal crew away with most of our accumulated treasure. They believe I suffer from madness brought on by our years at sea. Perhaps they are right, but I have glimpsed what dwells within the compass, what whispers promises of godhood in exchange for release. I know now why the Portuguese captain became obsessed, why his crew mutinied. This thing, this Nix Maria, as named in the texts I recovered from the São Cristóvão, cannot be controlled as I once believed." The final entry, its lettering shaky but determined: "Tonight I perform the ritual described in the Portuguese captain's journal, not to control the entity as he attempted, but to strengthen its prison. I have prepared the barrel with the symbols copied from the text, using my own blood to reinforce the bindings. If I fail, may God have mercy on whoever finds this cursed object. If I succeed, may it remain contained until the end of time. I was a fool to believe I could harness such power. Some forces are not meant for mortal hands." He resisted, Malcolm said quietly, a newfound respect for the pirate captain washing over him. He could have sought power but chose containment instead. "A lesson worth remembering," Professor Nakamura noted pointedly. The water droplets on the ceiling suddenly coalesced, falling not as random drops, but as a perfect circular pattern around them. The compass in its container began to vibrate violently. "It knows what we've discovered," Helena warned. "We need to begin the ritual now." "Here," Malcolm said, understanding dawning. "This chamber is where Blackheart performed his version of the binding. This is where we need to be." Professor Nakamura worked methodically, arranging ritual components in a precise pattern around Blackheart's chamber. Father Thomas stood nearby, softly reciting protective phrases from his family's tradition. Helena cross-referenced symbols from the compass with those in her books, ensuring their understanding was complete. Malcolm should have been assisting, but a pulsing headache had taken hold, intensifying with each passing minute. The protective amulet around his neck felt increasingly heavy, its surface uncomfortably warm against his skin. "Dad?" Eliza approached, concern evident in her expression. "You're pale. Just tired," he managed, though the lie felt obvious. The truth was more disturbing. He could feel Nixmara's presence pressing against his consciousness, probing for weaknesses with far greater intensity than before. "The proximity to the compass is strengthening its connection to you," Professor Nakamura observed, pausing in his preparations. "The entity recognized you as a potential vessel from the beginning." "I can handle it," Malcolm insisted, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chamber's chill. "Perhaps you should wait outside," Helena suggested. "No," Malcolm's response came too quickly, too forcefully. "I need to see this through." The truth he couldn't admit was that part of him still craved the knowledge the entity had promised. The secrets of lost maritime civilizations, the answers to historical mysteries that had consumed his career. Even knowing the danger, the temptation remained. "The ritual requires 5 participants," Professor Nakamura added, "each representing an element of the original binding. We cannot proceed without Dr. Thorne." A sudden tremor ran through the cave, sending small stones clattering from the ceiling. The water that had been flowing in unnatural patterns across the walls began to pulse in rhythm with the compass's glow. "It's gathering strength," Father Thomas warned. "We must begin." They took positions as Professor Nakamura had instructed, forming a pentagon around the space where the compass would be placed. Malcolm stood at the point representing knowledge, the element through which Nixmara had first tempted him. As Father Thomas opened the reinforced container, the compass's green glow intensified dramatically, casting sickly shadows across their faces. The trident needle spun wildly before stopping, pointing directly at Malcolm. Pain lanced through his skull. Malcolm gasped, dropping to one knee as his vision blurred. Through the haze he saw the others' concerned faces, heard their voices, as if from underwater. "Malcolm!" Helena moved toward him, but Professor Nakamura held up a warning hand. "Do not break the formation," he cautioned. "The entity seeks disruption." The pressure in Malcolm's mind intensified, accompanied by a voice that seemed to originate from within his own thoughts. "They restrict you as they would restrict us. Knowledge is power, and power is meant to be claimed." "Get out of my head," Malcolm growled through clenched teeth. "We are already there," the voice replied with cold amusement. "Have been since you first dreamed of the deep as a child. Your mind has always been attuned to our frequency, a natural vessel." Malcolm felt his control slipping, his body becoming increasingly foreign to his commands. His hand moved without his volition, reaching toward the compass despite his desperate effort to resist. "Dad, fight it." Eliza's voice penetrated the fog surrounding his mind. "The binding weakens," Professor Nakamura observed tensely. "We must accelerate the ritual." He began chanting in an ancient language, the symbols in his journal glowing faintly in response. Father Thomas joined with his own traditional prayers, creating a counterpoint that momentarily caused the compass to dim. Malcolm felt the entity's rage as its influence was challenged. The pressure in his mind became crushing, drowning out his own thoughts beneath a torrent of alien consciousness. "Insufficient," Nixmara's voice reverberated within him. "Their knowledge is fragmentary, their understanding incomplete." To his horror, Malcolm found himself standing, his body moving with fluid grace that wasn't his own. When he spoke, the voice that emerged carried the deep resonance of the ocean depths beneath his normal tones. "Your rituals are broken echoes," he heard himself say. "Shadows of knowledge lost centuries ago." Helena took an instinctive step back. "Malcolm?" "He can't hear you now," the entity replied through Malcolm's lips. "His consciousness recedes while ours expands." "Dad?" Eliza moved toward him despite Professor Nakamura's warning. "I know you're in there." Malcolm struggled against the overwhelming force occupying his mind. It was like swimming against a riptide, each effort driving him further from shore. But Eliza's voice provided a focal point, something to orient himself toward. Through tremendous effort, he managed to force out words that were truly his own. "Eliza, get back. Not safe." "That's it, Dad. Keep fighting." Eliza reached out, touching the sea glass pendant she wore, a gift from Malcolm on her 16th birthday, collected from the beach below their home. The simple blue-green glass had no mystical properties, no protective symbols, but the emotional connection it represented created a momentary bridge to Malcolm's submerged consciousness. In that brief window of clarity, Malcolm fought through the entity's control enough to gasp. "The compass responds to blood." Blackheart used his own to strengthen the binding. "Blood sacrifice," Professor Nakamura nodded with grim understanding. "Of course, the original Mariathel ritual would have required it." The entity surged within Malcolm, reasserting control, his body straightened, eyes now glowing with the same sickly green as the compass. Water from the walls flowed toward him, enveloping his lower body like a second skin. "Your knowledge grows," Nix Maria spoke through him. "But too late. The vessel accepts us willingly." "That's a lie," Eliza challenged, still clutching her pendant. "My father would never consent to this." Within the prison of his own mind, Malcolm clung to his daughter's certainty. The entity had twisted his academic curiosity, his lifelong pursuit of knowledge, into something that resembled consent. But Eliza was right. He would never willingly serve as vessel to something that threatened those he loved. With that realization came a moment of strength. Malcolm fought through the possession long enough to tear the protective amulet from around his neck and thrust it toward Eliza. "Take it," he gasped, in his own voice. "Use it in the ritual." The cave trembled as Professor Nakamura placed the ancient obsidian bowl at the center of their formation. It was a simple vessel, unadorned save for wave patterns etched around its rim, yet it radiated an unmistakable energy that seemed to oppose the compass's sickly glow. "This receptacle was used in the original binding ceremonies," he explained, his voice steady despite the increasingly chaotic conditions. "It will serve as the focus for our ritual." Malcolm struggled against the entity controlling his body, gaining momentary victories, a finger that responded to his will, a single word forced through his lips before being submerged again beneath Nax Maria's dominance. Through eyes that no longer fully obeyed him, he watched the others position themselves with desperate resolve. "The ritual requires 5 elements," Professor Nakamura continued, addressing the others while keeping Malcolm's possessed form in his peripheral vision. "Knowledge, which Malcolm represents whether he wishes to or not. Faith, embodied by Father Thomas. History, represented by Dr. Walsh. Protection, now carried by Eliza with the amulet. And separation, which I will channel through the ritual dagger." "What do we do?" Helena asked, her academic composure fraying as water began to flow up the walls with increasing speed, defying gravity and natural law. "Form the pentagon again," Professor Nakamura instructed. "When I begin the incantation, each of you must focus on your element. Visualize it as a force countering the entity." Father Thomas opened his book of prayers, his weathered hands steady despite the danger. "These words have been preserved through generations of my family. I was told they might never be needed, but we kept the vigil nonetheless." Eliza clutched the protective amulet Malcolm had thrust into her hands, her eyes never leaving her father's struggle. "Will this restore him? If we succeed in binding the entity?" "Yes," Professor Nakamura answered, though something in his tone suggested uncertainty. They took their positions, Professor Nakamura at the point representing separation, Father Thomas at faith, Helena at history, and Eliza at protection. Malcolm's partially possessed form stood unwillingly at knowledge, fighting for each breath against the entity's control. Professor Nakamura filled the ritual bowl with seawater collected from the cave entrance. As the liquid settled in the ancient vessel, it began to glow with a soft blue luminescence that countered the compass's toxic green. In ancient times, this ritual would have been conducted by 5 trained priests over several days, he warned. We must compress it into a single ceremony within perfect knowledge. The risk is considerable. We have no choice, Helena reminded him, her gaze fixed on Malcolm's struggle. The professor nodded grimly, then raised the ritual dagger. Its obsidian blade caught the competing lights, blue from the bowl, green from the compass, creating prismatic effects across the chamber walls. He began to chant in a language none of them recognized, older than Latin, more fluid than Greek, with sounds that seemed to mimic water flowing over stone. As the incantation continued, the symbols in his journal began to glow with the same blue light as the ritual bowl. Father Thomas joined with his family's traditional prayers, creating a harmonic counterpoint to the professor's chant. The protective symbols around the chamber walls brightened in response. Helena's contribution came through knowledge, reciting the historical accounts of Nix Maria's binding, as documented in her research, providing context and continuity to the ritual. Eliza held the amulet toward her father, focusing on its protective purpose with all her emotional strength. "Come back to us, Dad," she whispered. "Fight it." Within the prison of his own mind, Malcolm heard her. The entity's control faltered momentarily as the ritual energies built around them. With tremendous effort, he forced his own voice through. "The compass, place it in the bowl." Professor Nakamura nodded without breaking his chant. Using the ritual dagger, he carefully lifted the compass and passed it into the glowing water within the bowl. The moment of contact produced a flash of competing energies, green fighting blue in crackling arcs above the water's surface. The entity's rage surged through Malcolm's body. "Ignorant mortals," it spoke through him, his voice distorted by inhuman undertones. "You attempt what the Mariathal priests could barely achieve with perfect knowledge." Perhaps Professor Nakamura acknowledged during a pause in his chant, "But they bound you once. We need only repeat their success." They had hundreds of trained practitioners, the entity counted. "You are 5, with fragments of understanding. We have something they didn't." Eliza interjected, her voice gaining strength. "We've seen what you truly are. Not a deity to be worshipped, but a parasite requiring hosts." The compass in the ritual bowl spun violently, water splashing over the sides despite no physical disturbance. The cave rumbled more intensely, small fragments of stone raining down from the ceiling. "The ritual destabilizes the physical structure," Helena warned. "The cave could collapse." "We cannot stop," Professor Nakamura insisted, resuming his chant with increased urgency. The water throughout the chamber began to coalesce, flowing toward Malcolm's possessed form. It engulfed his legs up to the knees, then continued climbing, forming a second skin of flowing liquid that amplified the entity's control. "Your binding weakens," Nix Mara proclaimed through Malcolm, "while our manifestation grows stronger." It was true. Despite the ritual's power, the water level in the cave continued to rise unnaturally, flowing in from the ocean through unseen cracks and channels. The entity was gathering its element, preparing for a more complete manifestation. "Something's wrong," Father Thomas observed, his prayers faltering. "The binding isn't taking hold." Professor Nakamura's expression grew grave as he studied the compass in the ritual bowl. "The fragment within Malcolm interferes with the binding. As long as it maintains a foothold in his consciousness, we cannot fully contain the entity within the compass." "What does that mean?" Eliza demanded, fear evident in her voice. "It means," the entity answered, through Malcolm's lips, curling them into an unnatural smile, "that to save your father, you must abandon your world to us." Through the watery prison surrounding his mind, Malcolm felt the terrible truth. The ritual was failing, not because of imperfect knowledge or insufficient power, but because he himself had become a secondary vessel, a foothold that allowed the entity to resist being fully drawn back into the compass. Deep within the maelstrom of his own consciousness, Malcolm fought to reassert control. The entity's presence filled his mind like dark water, cold and ancient, pressing against the boundaries of his identity with relentless pressure. Each thought, each memory became a battlefield. Nix Maria claiming territory with every moment of weakness, every flicker of doubt. Your resistance is impressive, the entity communicated directly into his thoughts. Few mortals maintain awareness this long under our influence. Get out of my head, Malcolm pushed back, focusing on concrete memories to anchor himself. The day Eliza was born, Caroline's laugh, the satisfaction of discovering a historical connection others had missed. Why fight what you've sought your entire life? Nix Maria's presence shifted, becoming almost seductive. We offer what every historian dreams of, perfect knowledge of the past. Suddenly Malcolm found himself standing on the deck of a ship, not as an observer but fully present, feeling the roll of waves beneath his feet, tasting salt spray on his lips. Around him, sailors in 18th century garb worked with practiced efficiency. At the helm stood a powerfully built man with a neatly trimmed beard and calculating eyes, unmistakably William Blackheart, Connolly. "This is real," the entity whispered through the vision. "Not imagination or reconstruction, but true memory. We were there. We have witnessed the entirety of human maritime history." The scene shifted rapidly. Malcolm watched Phoenician traders navigate by stars, Viking longships cutting through northern waters, Chinese treasure fleets with sails like clouds on the horizon. Each vision carried perfect sensory detail, history made visceral and immediate. "This knowledge can be yours," Nix Maria promised. "Every question answered, every theory confirmed or corrected. Your academic vindication would be complete and irrefutable." The temptation pulled at Malcolm's scholarly soul. How many nights had he spent poring over fragmentary records, trying to reconstruct voyages centuries past? How often had he defended theories based on incomplete evidence against skeptical colleagues? "And what's the price?" Malcolm challenged, fighting through the seductive historical panorama. "What happens when you're fully freed?" The visions disappeared, replaced by darkness. "Merely a rebalancing," the entity replied. "Water covers most of your world already. We would simply expand our domain." New images appeared, coastal cities submerged beneath advancing tides, great waves sweeping inland for miles, humanity retreating to shrinking territories as the oceans reclaimed the land. "You would drown millions," Malcolm realized with horror. "We would restore what once was," the entity corrected. "Before your kind crawled from the shallows and forgot your origins." Outside the mental battlefield, in the physical world of the cave, Malcolm was dimly aware of the ritual continuing. Professor Nakamura's voice had taken on a desperate edge as he worked to modify the binding ceremony, attempting to compensate for the entity's foothold in Malcolm's consciousness. "The connection between the compass and the host must be severed," the professor was saying. "Otherwise the ritual cannot be completed." "How do we do that?" Eliza's voice penetrated Malcolm's mental prison, providing momentary clarity. In the original ceremony, Helena's academic tone had turned grim. A sacrifice was required, life energy to power the binding. "No," Eliza protested. Their voices faded as Nix Maria reasserted control over Malcolm's perception. The entity didn't speak now, but showed him another vision. This one of Blackheart, in his final hours, performing his own version of the binding ritual in this very chamber. The pirate captain stood before a makeshift altar, the compass glowing malevolently before him. Blackheart's face showed the strain of fighting the entity's influence, much as Malcolm now experienced. But there was also determination, the iron will that had made him a feared captain. "I won't be your puppet," Blackheart growled in the vision, drawing a knife across his palm. "Nor will I let you free to plague other men's minds." Malcolm watched as the pirate captain used his own blood to draw symbols around the compass, containing it through desperate improvisation based on fragmented knowledge, effective but incomplete, a temporary solution that had lasted centuries until Malcolm's discovery. He resisted you, Malcolm realized. He chose containment over power. A fool's choice, Nix Maria dismissed. He could have ruled the seas as no pirate ever has, as you could rule maritime history, rewriting every text with perfect knowledge. But the vision had shown Malcolm something crucial. Blackheart had found the strength to resist by focusing on something beyond himself, not family or love, which the pirate lacked, but responsibility toward humanity at large. The captain had recognized the entity's true nature and chosen sacrifice over personal gain. In the physical world, the cave shuddered violently. The water surrounding Malcolm's body churned with increasing agitation as the entity sensed his renewed resistance. "Your ritual fails," Nix Maria spoke through Malcolm's lips to the others. "The binding weakens with each passing moment." Professor Nakamura looked up from his desperate modifications, sweat beading on his forehead. "He's right. Without severing the connection to the host, we cannot complete the containment. There must be another way," Eliza insisted, still holding the protective amulet toward her father. Through tremendous effort, Malcolm broke through the entity's control momentarily. "There is," he gasped in his own voice, "Blackheart's method. Life energy willingly given." He forced his gaze toward the silver chain around Blackheart's neck in the vision, the captain's most prized possession, now visible to Malcolm's inner eye. Understanding bloomed. The chain had served as a conductor for the pirate's life force, channeling it into the binding. "Malcolm." "No," Helena protested, understanding his implication. "Not my life," Malcolm clarified, fighting for each word against the entity's resistance. "But part of it, enough to power the binding, while leaving me alive." The entity's rage surged through him like a tidal wave, nearly drowning his consciousness completely. "Silence," it roared, using Malcolm's voice distorted beyond recognition. The cave walls shuddered as if under assault from the ocean itself. Fissures appeared in the ancient stone, releasing thin streams of seawater that moved with deliberate purpose rather than natural flow. The entity's rage manifested physically, its control over water extending throughout the hideout. "We're running out of time," Professor Nakamura warned, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of rushing water and cracking stone. "The structural integrity is failing." Malcolm felt the entity's grip on his mind loosen fractionally as it diverted power to attack the physical environment. He seized the opportunity, forcing his consciousness to the surface with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for air. "The ritual," he gasped, his own voice emerging hoarse but determined. "How much life energy is needed?" Professor Nakamura's expression turned grave. "To power a complete binding. Traditionally, a full sacrifice. And for a temporary containment?" Malcolm pressed, fighting to maintain control as the entity surged back against his will. "Partial life force might suffice," the professor admitted reluctantly, "but the process would still be dangerous, potentially debilitating." Malcolm nodded, decision crystallizing through the fog of the entity's influence. Like Blackheart, he survived, but gave enough to contain it. "Dad." "No," Eliza protested, understanding his intent. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Malcolm managed, clarity momentarily complete as he focused on his daughter's face. "The binding needs power, and I'm already connected to it." A column of water erupted from the ritual bowl, the compass spinning violently within it. The entity reasserted control, Malcolm's body stiffening as Nix Maria fought to suppress his consciousness. "Pathetic creatures," it spoke through him, voice distorted. "You cannot bind what you do not comprehend." Father Thomas stepped forward, his weathered features set with determination. "I'll do it," he offered. "My family has maintained the watch for generations. It would be fitting." "No," Professor Nakamura countered. "The connection must flow through the one already linked to the entity. Any other sacrifice would be rejected." Through the prison of his possessed body, Malcolm saw Helena studying Blackheart's logbook with frantic intensity. "There might be a way," she said suddenly. Blackheart describes using his silver chain as a conductor, creating a circuit between himself, the compass, and the barrel. The containment vessel, Professor Nakamura nodded with dawning understanding. Yes, a physical medium could modulate the life force transfer, making it survivable. The entity's fury redoubled, water now swirling around Malcolm's body in a protective cocoon. "You will not trap us again." It seethed through his lips. With a tremendous effort of will, Malcolm fought through the possession. Years of academic discipline, of patiently piecing together historical narratives from fragmentary evidence, had honed his mental focus. He seized control of his right arm, the limb shaking violently as competing wills battled for dominance. His fingers closed around the chain he wore, not Blackheart's silver one, but the simple steel chain supporting the protective amulet Father Thomas had given him, which now hung around Eliza's neck. "The amulet," he gasped. "Give it back to me." Understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes, followed immediately by fear. "It could kill you." "Trust me," Malcolm pleaded, genuine tears forming as he fought the entity's control. "I need to finish what Blackheart started." Professor Nakamura nodded grimly. "The symbolism is appropriate. The amulet has protected the bloodline of the Watchers for generations. It can serve as the conductor." With visible reluctance, Eliza removed the amulet. "Come back to us," she whispered, placing it in Malcolm's trembling hand. The moment his fingers closed around the stone disc, Malcolm felt the protective symbols resonate against the entity's presence. Nix Maria recoiled within his mind, creating a momentary space of clarity. "Now," Malcolm instructed, voice steady with purpose. "Complete the ritual." Professor Nakamura resumed the ancient chant, modifying the words to incorporate this new element. Father Thomas added his family's traditional prayers, while Helena read aloud the binding symbols from her research. Malcolm's mind filled with the visions Nix Maria had shown him, maritime history spanning millennia, knowledge beyond any historian's dreams. The temptation remained powerful, but he recognized it now for what it was, bait in a trap that would cost far more than he would gain. "You could know everything," the entity whispered directly into his thoughts, a final desperate temptation. Every ship, every voyage, every maritime mystery solved with perfect clarity. "Some knowledge isn't meant for us," Malcolm replied internally. "Some mysteries should remain to be discovered by those who come after." With that rejection, he thrust the amulet into the ritual bowl alongside the compass. The water within erupted with blue-white energy that encircled his arm like living lightning. Pain beyond anything Malcolm had experienced surged through him as the circuit completed, his life force flowing through the amulet into the compass. The entity fought desperately, using every weapon in its considerable arsenal. It showed Malcolm visions of academic vindication, of historical discoveries that would make his name immortal. When those failed, it shifted to threats. Eliza drowning, Helena lost at sea, coastal cities destroyed by unnatural tsunamis. Malcolm endured it all, focusing on a single purpose containing the entity, as Blackheart had before him. He felt years of his life draining away, flowing into the binding, like water through a broken dam. Gray streaked his hair, lines deepened around his eyes, joints ached with sudden arthritis, the physical manifestation of life energy being consumed. "Enough!" Professor Nakamura shouted, seeing Malcolm's rapid aging. He moved to break the connection, but Malcolm's free hand shot out, gripping the professor's wrist with surprising strength. "Not yet," Malcolm insisted, his voice rough, but entirely his own. "The binding isn't complete." The compass in the ritual bowl had begun to absorb the swirling water, drawing the entity's essence back into itself. The symbols around its edge glowed blue-white rather than sickly green, signifying the binding's progress. Blood began to flow from Malcolm's nose, his ears, the corners of his eyes, physical evidence of the toll being exacted. Yet his expression showed not pain, but determination. The same iron resolve visible in Blackheart's face in the vision of the pirate's final stand. The cave trembled as though the entire ocean pressed against it. Chunks of ceiling crashed down, narrowly missing the ritual participants. Water no longer seeped, but gushed through expanding fissures, swirling with unnatural purpose around the chamber. At the center of the maelstrom stood Malcolm, one hand thrust into the ritual bowl where the compass spun frantically. Blue-white energy continued to flow from his body through the amulet, feeding the binding ritual with his life force. His hair had turned completely silver, his face deeply lined, his body bent as though decades had passed in minutes. "It's working," Professor Nakamura confirmed, his voice raised above the tumult. "The entity is being drawn back into the compass." Indeed, the water throughout the chamber had begun spiraling toward the ritual bowl, as if pulled by an invisible whirlpool. The entity fought desperately, manifesting partial humanoid forms that reached toward Malcolm with fluid limbs before being sucked back into the vortex. "Malcolm Thorne," Nixmaria's voice resonated throughout the chamber, no longer speaking through him but from the water itself. "You would sacrifice your remaining years for this temporary victory." "Not temporary," Malcolm countered, his voice frail but determined. "Permanent. This time." Professor Nakamura nodded in grim agreement. "We understand the binding better now. With proper containment, it can be sealed indefinitely." The entity's rage manifested as a screaming gale that whipped through the chamber, carrying salt spray and ancient malice. "Others will come, curious fools like yourself, seeking knowledge beyond their understanding. We need only wait." "Perhaps," Father Thomas acknowledged, his book of prayers clutched firmly despite the chaos. "But my family's vigil will continue. The watchers remain." As if triggered by his words, ethereal chains of blue-white energy began materializing around the compass. First one, then dozens, then hundreds, each manifested with a sound like distant bells, wrapping around the artifact in complex, overlapping patterns. "The binding chains," Helena gasped, recognizing the phenomenon from ancient accounts. Just as described in the Marathal texts. The entity's struggles intensified as the chains multiplied. Water forms rose and fell around Malcolm, attempting to break his connection to the ritual bowl. One surged toward Eliza, but Professor Nakamura intercepted it with the obsidian dagger, the ancient blade dispersing the watery construct on contact. "You cannot hold us forever," Nixmaria raged, its voice diminishing as more of its essence was drawn back into the compass. "We are eternal. We are the deep that remembers when all was ocean." "And you will remain memory," Malcolm replied, his strength fading visibly with each passing moment. "Where you belong." The ritual bowl began to overflow with energy rather than water, blue-white tendrils extending to touch each participant. Father Thomas's prayers grew stronger, his weathered voice carrying centuries of his family's vigilance. Helena recited binding symbols with academic precision, each word reinforcing the chains manifesting around the compass. Professor Nakamura's obsidian dagger traced protective patterns in the air, leaving glowing after images that solidified into additional constraints. Eliza moved to Malcolm's side, supporting his weakening body. "Dad, you have to let go soon. It's killing you." Malcolm shook his head, face drawn with pain but eyes clear. "Not yet. Almost there." The compass's frantic spinning had begun to slow as the chains tightened around it. The trident needle, once pointing accusingly at Malcolm, now spun aimlessly, its connection to him severed as the entity was pulled back into its prison. With a sound like the ocean floor shifting, a final massive surge of energy pulsed through the chamber. The remaining water forms collapsed simultaneously, flowing into the ritual bowl in a last, violent rush. The compass absorbed it all, its obsidian surface now glowing blue-white rather than toxic green. Malcolm collapsed as the circuit finally broke, the amulet falling from his nerveless fingers. Eliza caught him, easing him gently to the floor, as the chaotic energies throughout the chamber began to subside. "Is it done?" Helena asked, moving cautiously toward the ritual bowl. Professor Nakamura nodded, studying the compass with expert eyes. "The binding is complete, more thoroughly than before. The entity made one final, desperate attempt. The compass rose slightly from the bowl, vibrating with effort. But the ethereal chains held firm, forcing it back down with an almost musical chime of reinforcement. "We will need proper containment," Father Thomas said. The barrel Malcolm found was Blackheart's improvisation. "We can do better. I have colleagues who can help," Professor Nakamura agreed. "A secure location, multiple layers of protection." Malcolm stirred in Eliza's arms, his eyes fluttering open. Though physically aged beyond his years, his gaze held peace rather than regret. The binding held. "Yes," Eliza confirmed, tears tracking down her cheeks. "You did it, Dad." A faint smile touched his lips. "Worth it." The cave gave another ominous shudder, larger chunks of ceiling crashing down around them. The structural integrity, compromised by the entity's assault, was failing rapidly. "We need to leave," Helena urged, gathering her books. The entire system could collapse. Professor Nakamura carefully lifted the compass from the ritual bowl, now quiescent within its cage of ethereal chains. He wrapped it in protective cloth inscribed with additional binding symbols, then placed it within a small wooden box he'd brought for this purpose. "A temporary measure," he explained, "until proper containment can be arranged." Father Thomas helped Eliza lift Malcolm to his feet. Though weakened dramatically by the life force drain, he could still walk with assistance. His academic's curiosity remained intact, despite his ordeal. "The chains," he murmured, glancing back at the compass as they began their retreat. "They weren't part of the original ritual description." "No," Professor Nakamura agreed. "I believe they manifested because our binding combined multiple traditions, the Marerathil symbols, Father Thomas's family prayers, Dr. Walsh's historical knowledge, your connection to the entity, and my ritual implements. Together they created something stronger than any single approach." "Synergy," Malcolm nodded weakly. "History, faith, protection, knowledge, and separation, working in harmony." As they made their way through the crumbling passage toward the cave entrance, the hideout that had preserved Blackheart's secrets for centuries began its final collapse. Behind them, the chamber where two bindings had now taken place, filled with seawater, but natural seawater, following the ordinary laws of physics rather than an entity's malevolent will. 3 months later, Malcolm sat on the porch of his coastal cottage, a woolen blanket draped across his legs despite the summer warmth. The physical toll of the binding ritual had left its mark: silver hair where once was salt and pepper, deeper lines etched around eyes that had witnessed things beyond historical record, joints that ached with each change in barometric pressure. Yet there was peace in his gaze as he watched the ocean, its waves now following only natural rhythms. The unnatural storms had ceased the moment the entity was contained. Local fishermen reported the best season in decades, as if the sea itself celebrated its liberation from Nix Maria's influence. "Tea, Dad." Eliza emerged from the cottage, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "Thank you." Malcolm accepted the offering with hands that trembled slightly, another lasting effect of the life force drain. Eliza settled into the chair beside him, her expression mixing concern with respect. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job to stay with him during his recovery, though recovery wasn't quite the right word. The years he'd sacrificed couldn't be regained. The binding had permanently accelerated his aging. "Professor Nakamura called this morning," she said, after a comfortable silence. "The new containment facility is complete." Malcolm nodded. "Good. Where did they decide?" "An island monastery in the North Atlantic. Apparently it's been a sacred site since pre-Christian times, with natural properties that suppress supernatural energies." She smiled slightly. "Father Thomas's family has connections there. They've been preparing for this possibility for generations." "Watchers indeed," Malcolm mused. "How many other secrets have coastal communities kept through the centuries, I wonder?" "You could research it," Eliza suggested. "Once you're stronger." Malcolm's lips curved in a wry smile. "Perhaps. though I suspect some knowledge is best left to those already entrusted with it. The compass itself, now permanently sealed within multiple containment layers designed by Professor Nakamura in consultation with traditions from around the world, had been transported under heavy guard to its final resting place. The entity within remained quiet, though Malcolm occasionally felt faint echoes in his dreams, not communication, merely resonance from their former connection. "Any word from Helena?" he asked. "She's in London, working with the British Museum to properly document what can be safely shared about the Mariathel civilization." Eliza hesitated. "She's been careful to omit certain details." "As she should." Malcolm gazed out at the horizon. "Some discoveries aren't meant for academic journals." His academic vindication had come in unexpected form. With Helena's support, his theories about Blackheart's survival and hidden base had been confirmed through carefully selected artifacts recovered from the hideout before its collapse. The papers he'd published since had restored his scholarly reputation, though he found such validation held less importance than before. "I've been thinking," Eliza said, breaking another comfortable silence, "about what you experienced during the possession, the maritime history Nix Maria showed you." Malcolm nodded. "Fragments remain, like memories of dreams, fading but still accessible if I concentrate. Do you regret not accepting its offer?" she asked carefully. "All that knowledge lost, not lost," Malcolm corrected. "Just waiting to be discovered properly, piece by piece, by generations of historians yet to come." He smiled. "That's the true joy of historical research, you know. Not possessing complete knowledge, but the journey of discovery itself." From his pocket, he withdrew a small object, a medallion fashioned from one of the links of Blackheart's silver chain, recovered from the chamber before their escape. Though the bulk of the chain had been incorporated into the compass's new containment system, Professor Nakamura had preserved this single link, fashioning it into a simple pendant. "The professor sent this," Malcolm explained, handing it to Eliza. "He thought it fitting that we keep a reminder." The medallion appeared ordinary except in certain lights, when it seemed to glow faintly with residual energy from the binding ritual. Not dangerous, Professor Nakamura had assured them, but a connection to what they had experienced and a warning to remain vigilant. "For you," Malcolm said as Eliza examined it. "Eh? But your connection to Blackheart is complete," Malcolm finished. "My academic quest is fulfilled. But someone should remember, should maintain a connection to what happened." Understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes. "You want me to be a watcher?" "In a sense, not with the formality of Father Thomas's lineage, but with awareness." He reached over to close her fingers around the medallion. "Knowledge without obsession, vigilance without fear." As Eliza slipped the chain around her neck, a ray of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the cottage in golden light. The medallion briefly flashed blue-white, acknowledging its new bearer. "Do you think it's truly over?" Eliza asked, her hand instinctively touching the pendant. Malcolm considered the question, gazing out at the ocean that had been his lifelong obsession. Nix Maria is contained more thoroughly than ever before. The knowledge of how to maintain that containment is in responsible hands. He smiled at his daughter. "But eternal vigilance is the price of security, as the saying goes." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The ocean reflected the changing light, transforming from deep blue to gold to crimson, beautiful and powerful, but natural in its rhythms and movements. Malcolm felt contentment settle over him. His academic journey had taken an unexpected turn into realms beyond conventional history, but in doing so, had brought him to a deeper understanding of why the past mattered. Not merely for knowledge's sake, but for the guidance it offered to the present and future. "I think I'll write my memoirs," he said suddenly. "Not everything, of course, but enough to preserve what should be remembered." Eliza smiled. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Dad." As darkness fell, the medallion around Eliza's neck continued its barely perceptible glow, a small light against the gathering night, a reminder of vigilance maintained through generations past and those yet to come.